lectures in our series, Tyranny and Democracy. Today we have the pleasure to listen to a lecture by Professor Mirko Canevaro from the University of Edinburgh. And Professor Canevaro is a professor of Greek history at the University of Edinburgh, and he published a monograph, The Documents in the Attic Orators, published by Oxford University Press almost 10 years ago. And he's also an author of a commentary on Demosthenes against Leptines, published by the Kreuter, as well as he co-authored commentary of Book 4 of Aristotle's Politics. And he's currently working on the deliberative structures of Athenian decision-making, as well as on honor and inequality in ancient Greece. And that is in cooperation with Professor Douglas Kearns, whom we have pleasure to guest here as well in our audience. Welcome, Professor Kearns, and as well as all those who have been previously to our seminars, webinars, or the new people I can see are joining us. So we will have a lecture by Professor Canevaro first, and then we will have a Q&A, a discussion. You can raise your hand if you want to say something, because there is a few people here already, so it will be the easiest way, and we have time until 8 p.m. Polish time. In any case, an hour and a half. Yes, I just want to say that, as you all know, we are in a very strange situation right now. We have war. So our project, our series of lectures about tyranny and democracy have a somewhat different significance right now, I think, because we see what tyranny can actually do with our own eyes, although we have studied it and thinking about it for such a long time. And I think especially the subject of today's lecture seems quite important to understanding what is going on. Namely, Professor Canevaro will be speaking about the links between tyranny and honor. So, Professor Canevaro, the floor is yours.
Yes.
Okay, so just one request. So I suggest that anyone apart from the speaker turn off their cameras and phones for the time of the microphones for the time of the lecture. Sorry.
Right, so here I am. Off we go. First of all, I just want quickly to thank Mateusz and Edmund for the invitation to this wonderful series of lectures. I'm sure people have seen the links to the previous lectures in the series, and it's been a pleasure to follow them, although I mostly follow them afterwards, just watching the videos. But since the time is limited and there's much to be said, let's get started straight away. And if at any point you can't, since I can't see any faces or anything, if at any point you can't hear me anymore, the line has gone away or anything, just chat or shout at me or something. Right, so here we go. In his Olympiac and Philippic speeches, Demosthenes deploys against Philip the full panoply of stereotypes about tyrants. Yes, strictly speaking, Philip is not a Greek tyrant. Rather, in Demosthenes' invectives, a barbarian monarch with no business interfering in Greek affairs. Yet, like with the king of Persia, barbarian autocracy is often represented in Greek sources as the blueprint for the behavior of Greek tyrants, and tyranny accordingly as a distinctively un-Greek form of government. Thus, Philip, like the tyrants of many accounts, is characterized by greed, swayed by his appetites and whims, is rule absolute and autocratic. It is the rule of one man as opposed to the rule of law, necessary precondition for a well-governed polity. something Edward Harris has discussed in a previous lecture in this series. There is also something distinctive about the way he manages relations with his kingdom and his court. According to the second Philippic, and this is one on your handout, Philip is so obsessed with his own reputation, with being the greatest king Macedon has ever seen, as to neglect everything else. He is single-minded about this, and his philotimia, his love of honor and his pursuit of honor, is exclusive. No one else in his kingdom can have any share in it, in the reputation, the honor of his successors. They contribute with their wealth, their time, their energy to this pursuit of honor, yet are not allowed to share in that honor in any way. In fact, Demosthenes claims, Philip actively humiliates anyone who, with his military acumen and results, deserves and therefore may lay claim to a share of that honor. They, and I quote, are removed by Philip out of philotimia, since he wishes to give the impression that every achievement is his alone. His philotimia is unsurpassable, and if anyone is sophron or dikaios, deserving in any way, he is pushed aside and treated as a nobody. The same point is made also in Demosthenes' response to the letter of Philip. I quote, Philip is so philotimos that he claims every great achievement for himself and is more distressed at those generals and leaders who have done something praiseworthy than at those who have utterly failed. The use of philotimos and philotimia in these passages at this point in time in the late 4th century in Athens is striking. The honor dynamics enacted by Philip are framed by Demosthenes as a direct inversion of the economy of honor that was considered central to Athenian democracy and to polis life more generally. In a speech very dear to my heart, the Against Leptines, Demosthenes spells out very clearly how the economy of honor should work. And you have a few passages about these too on your handout. In his account, in order for the demos to attract services from its benefactors, it needs to have the power to grant honors, timai, in exchange for those services, and needs to use this power liberally. The demos needs to have a reputation of generosity for its rewards. Reciprocity, as well as mutual respect, are at the basis of this relationship. Private as well as public favors create an obligation for the beneficiary, and the choices of each party to reciprocate and to provide favors in view of reciprocation, when generalized, fosters social cohesion and enhance the honor of both parties. The benefactor is honored by the demos for his performance, and the demos is acknowledged in its prerogative, in its time, to assess performance and distribute honors kataxian, according to worth. Benefactors then offer their services to Athens because of philotimia. This term literally means love of honor and describes both the psychological state of the individual that actively pursues time and the concrete action that leads others to recognize that time. Such recognition is functional to time itself, because the time of an individual is both his own worth, as well as his claims on account of that worth, what Erving Goffman called demeanor, and the external recognition of this worth, what Goffman called deference. The concept of philotimia was developed in Athens, and in many other polis, into a civic ideology of the reward, the dorea, as incentive for virtue. The Pericles of Thucydides' Book 2, for instance, states that where the rewards for merit are greatest, there are found the best citizens. And Isocrates describes praise for honorants as key to encouraging the young to show more philotimia towards arete, knowing that this will secure them praise. Now, in polis ideology, philotimia is a form of ambition, no doubt, but the honor it pursues is non-exclusive. Honor dynamics, that is, are not a zero-sum game whereby honor is a scarce, non-material commodity that can only be accumulated by denying it to others or actively extracting it from others. Quite the contrary. Honorary decrees, for instance, treat time as infinitely generalizable. Something that emerges quite clearly from the evidence is that the target of the hortatory formulas that we find in many honorary decrees is almost invariably pantes. And you have examples at 3 on your handout. So I offer 2 examples among many. IG 2Q1306 honors Phanodemos in order that everyone else may also be aware that the people and council know how to give thanks to those who speak and act excellently on behalf of the council and the people. And Agora 16112 honors a benefactor in order that all those who happen to serve in the council may know that the demos honors those who conduct themselves on the political scene in the council and in the assembly justly and according to the laws, and so that they may seek honor to the highest degree, advising and proposing the best course of action to the council and the assembly, in the knowledge that those who do so receive charis in return from the demos. Standard hortatory intention clauses seem to envision an ideal scenario then, in which everyone behaves in such a way as to gain honors for his performance. A generalized striving to excel as emulation to make clear that there is not the Greek word, has in fact tended to circumscribe and reify honor as a single goal with specific and determinate content, as the external reward for competitive self-assertions. And you have some examples at 4 on your handout. Studies of honor in classical Athens, for example, focus on the extent to which institutions, particularly the law courts, provided an arena for feuding and aggressive competition on the various ways in which, Athenian democracy sought to channel citizens and non-citizens' competitive drive for esteem, their desire for esteem, as a source of communal advantage. I'm thinking about the work of Cohen, of Christ, and of many others. Such understandings of honor have their ultimate roots in the cultural determinist approach to anthropology made popular by Franz Boas and his school, notably by Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict. 5 on your handout. It was Benedict's 1946 study of Japanese culture to which Eric Dodds turned for inspiration in his account of how ancient Greece was transformed from shame culture to guilt culture in his famous The Greeks and the Irrational of 51. Comparable anthropological ideas exerted a strong influence in the view of honor articulated in Moses Finley's influential 1954 The Word of Odysseus. A crucial additional influence is to be found in similarly oriented studies of traditional Mediterranean societies, both Christian and Muslim, carried out from the 60s to the 80s. And this is particularly prominent, for example, in Orden's and Porcel's influential The Corrupting Sea. Together, this influence have given rise to a view of honor, and I'm quoting here Douglas Cairns' critical assessment of this body of work, as a scarce non-material commodity pursued mainly by men in small-scale, face-to-face communities in more or less aggressive forms of zero-sum competition, in which one person's gain is automatically another's loss, intimately bound up with assertive traditional forms of masculinity, and vulnerable especially to assaults on the honor, for example, the chastity of women. This view of honor as a monolithic notion with specific normative features found only in certain societies and not in others, has, however, been challenged in a growing body of recent work. And you have some examples of these at 6 on your handout. All of these emphasize, first, that honor, far from being a single value limited to a particular range of behaviors, is a reflex of a general human attachment to esteem capable of taking a wide variety of forms. And second, that honor is an inclusive concept adaptable to a wide range of group values, as much to do with one's obligations to others and to society as a whole as with the esteem that one seeks for oneself in competition with others. What these recent developments in the study of honor in general and Greek honor in particular, for example, in the context of our Edinburgh ERC Honor in Classical Greece project, and you have a list of works, preliminary work and recent work at 7 on your handout, what these studies have demonstrated then is that the pursuit of honor is not inherently competitive. It can in fact be cooperative. It is not inherently zero-sum. It can as easily engender win-win dynamics. And in fact, it is in its cooperative, emulative, non-zero-sum variety that is the most common in historical societies. Honor, as central to social interaction, is not primarily attained or lost by dishonoring others or by being dishonored by others. As Appia has shown, for example, social actors in all societies retain their honor by abiding by specific honor codes, he calls them, normative system, and therefore by behaving and treating others in socially acceptable ways according to their rank, their specific dignity, and their own sense of honor. Honor codes are variable among cultures, yet whether we are talking about 19th century China, modern Pakistan, Homeric society, or early modern Britain, it appears that honor codes have in common the aim of securing a certain level of social harmony, or at least of reducing social strife by regulating social relations. In no society was honor ever truly meant to create a bellum omnium contra omnes, and when such a situation occurs, it represents the breakdown of the system rather than its natural outcome. To give only 2 examples of recent historical scholarship that has made these points forcefully, one could look at Cairns, Van Vies, and Skodell's work on Homeric society, or at Linda Pollock's work on early modern British aristocracy. Pollock downplays the role of violence in early modern English honor codes and argues instead that they in fact promoted stability. In her words, honor could be an unsettling force, but for the most part, it enhanced social cohesiveness and commonality. Honor gave an individual dignity and worth, supplied a model for behavior, and provided a connection to others. Honor was part of an ethos of communal society, which prescribed that all work together to help support the honor and reputation of those with whom one was connected. Honor was not just a concept of entitlement, it was one of obligation. Now, if we go back to the Demosthenic passages from which we have started and look at them in the light of the scholarly developments and with the counterpoint of the Athenian honor system in mind, we realize that Demosthenes' remarks about Philip are rather pointed. They paint a picture that is the perversion of healthy honor dynamics and healthy emulative philotimia. Under Philip's rule, the worthy, far from being honored, are, I quote, treated as nobodies. The worthless, by contrast, receive advantages from the king. There is therefore a systematic mismatch between honor and desert. And the reason for this is that Philip mistakenly understands honor as zero-sum. For him, honor is, as it were, in scarce supply, and therefore praising and respecting others' worth and achievements is paramount to depriving himself of honor, repute, glory. He believes that the only way for him to accumulate honor is to take it away from others, even though they deserve it. Hubris is in the background of this whole description, as the king unwarrantedly arrogates all honor to himself, in the process denying due respect to others, the very definition of hubris. And the fact that this is not the hubris of a random individual, but of the absolute ruler of the state, means that his perverse understanding of honor does in fact engender a wider perverse honor system, the negation of healthy honor dynamics as they are understood in Athens and in most Greek polis. The questions I intend to ask and attempt to answer in the rest of this paper are the following. How idiosyncratic is this picture of Philip's rule as the perversion of healthy honor dynamics? Is this really about Philip's character, or is this depiction grounded in widespread Greek conceptualizations of what is distinctive of tyrannical power? To answer these questions, I want first to take a few steps back and turn to Herodotus to discuss a couple of episodes in his histories where we find in full display how complex and unsettling honor dynamics can be under an absolute ruler. Herodotus spends a lot of time discussing the Persian king's conduct in a variety of settings. As the alleged or perceived behavior of Persian kings is the blueprint for Greek conceptions of tyranny, what Herodotus describes can shed light on what was considered distinctive of such forms of rule. Herodotus is clear that the standard Greek practice of honoring one's benefactors is not unknown among the Persians. It is equally standard among them. This emerges, for example, in the episode of Zopyrus' sacrifice in Book 3, and you have it at 8 on your handout. He mutilates himself to gain access to Babylon and open the gates to Darius' army. He does so, I quote, because among the Persians a high value is placed on benefactions, and those who perform them are greatly honored in return. Persian kings, therefore, are aware that deserving behavior is appropriately met with proportionate honor and rewards. Yet the absolute power of the king introduces perverse features into these dynamics. These are evident, for example, in an episode of Xerxes' expedition, as he passed through Phrygia in Book 7. Xerxes and the army are entertained by Pythius, a wealthy Lydian. Pythius offers to donate his entire fortune toward funding Xerxes' expedition, and this was no small sum, as Pythius was the second richest man in the world after Xerxes. Xerxes refuses, and instead gives Pythius 7,000 gold statters as a gift, so that Pythius' fortune may reach the tidy sum of 4 million. He also makes him his guest friend. What we see here is both familiar and striking. On the one hand, Pythius' proposed service is met with suitable gratitude in the form of rewards and the honor of guest friendship. On the other, his offer is rejected because, first, Xerxes is unwilling to share the honor to be gained with the expedition with anyone else. The honor at stake is, in his view, a finite amount, and allowing Pythius to make such a substantial contribution towards the expedition that needs to be reciprocated with appropriate respect and status would directly result in Xerxes' loss of prospective honor. A zero-sum understanding of honor lurks behind the exchange, as it did behind Philip's behavior. Second, accepting Pythius' offer would undermine the asymmetrical relation between Xerxes and his subject. Xerxes is keen to keep the upper hand in such relationships and not to find himself in debt to one of his subjects. One way to look at what is going on here is through the categories of recognition respect and appraisal respect, as they are described by Stephen Dowell in a famous article of 1977, and you have some short definition at 9 on your handout and the full reference. Recognition respect for Dowell consists in giving appropriate consideration or recognition to some feature of its object in deliberating about what to do. Recognition respect is something that is due. It is based on some feature or action that, once recognized, create an obligation of respect. The respect due to a king, for example, is recognition respect. His kingly status cannot be ignored. Respecting him is not voluntary. It is an obligation. Conversely, appraisal respect is about acknowledging and showing esteem for some good performance, for some form of excellence, and does not involve an obligation. I may or may not decide to show esteem for a particular quality or action. It is really up to me. Xerxes is perfectly fine with showing Pythius appraisal respect that is freely given by him on the strength of his exalted status. But he seems rather more uncomfortable with entering a relationship that would in fact create a strong obligation of respect on his part. He is happy with showing esteem in exchange for the services of his subjects, as long as the choice to do so is his and his alone. His arbitrary will, rather than any strong right to respect they may claim, must be the fundamental criterion. How the story of Pythius continues and ends makes all this even clearer. Pythius is lured by the king's generosity and appraisal, respect, into a false sense of security, and asks him to spare the eldest of his 5 sons from participating in the expedition. You have the passage at 10 on your handout. Xerxes rages at impudence and shamelessness that told man an idea of a slave, he says. He decides to kill only Pythius' eldest son and presents this as a form of generosity. He could have killed all of them. The episode shows how punishment and reward are coached, as one would expect, in the language of reciprocity and honor, yet at the same time how the king is at pains to establish that they are ultimately dependent on his arbitrary will. He chooses freely what deserves a reward and what a punishment, and decides of either or both. It is, that is, his whim that governs the conferral of esteem, and his subjects are actively denied claims to recognition, respect. It is not casual that Xerxes describes here Pythius as a slave. Slaves have no claims to fair treatment and respect qua slaves. If they are accorded any esteem, that is because the master chooses freely to enter an honor relationship with them and accord them honor in exchange for particular services. Later in Book 7, the Spartans implicitly mirror Xerxes' own point of view when they explain to Hydarnes the reasons for their refusal to become Philoi of the king. Hydarnes notes that the king is fond of rewarding good men, yet, and here I'm quoting Douglas Cairns, the Spartans point to the inequality of this friendship. The deference required to elicit the king's esteem means exchanging freedom for slavery. A king can resent and punish a subject's lack of deference. The subject may hope that the king will reciprocate, but there is little one can do if he does not. With regard to his subjects, the Persian king, as represented by Herodotus, is relatively free of any need to accord recognition respect. Many of the threads that have emerged from my analysis so far are in fact effectively summarized in a powerful formulation found in Demosthenes against Leptines, which draws a distinction between the honors accorded under a democracy and those accorded by a tyrant or under an oligarchy, and explains why democratic honors are better, more valuable. You have the text at 11 on your handout. In this passage, as you see, Demosthenes stresses that tyrants and oligarchs have the ability to give superior rewards for service, superior in material terms. A tyrant can make anyone rich instantly and does so at will, on an voluntai. Demosthenes, that is, highlights both the size, often excessive, and the arbitrariness of the rewards given by absolute rulers, in contrast to those of a democracy. The same arbitrary will that confers such outsized prizes, however, can take them away in an instant. Such rewards are insecure because they do not depend on a recognized and binding claim, on a right, but rather on the whim of an individual. Democratic rewards, by contrast, are superior for their stability, te bebaioteti. They can be relied on because they are conferred in response to actions and services that produce binding claims to respect. They constitute recognition respect and are not just freely given in esteem. So they cannot and will not be taken away. And they are superior also in terms of the actual honor they entail, te de time. Here, time is used as mass to indicate value, the value of the honor and the corresponding value of the person that receives it. They are superior in the honor they entail because they are given not arbitrarily to reward flattery, but because one is believed by his peers to be worthy of them. Docunta axiontinos einai timathai. So he has a right to them. Again, Demosthenes plainly makes the point here that democratic honors are a form of recognition respect. They are not freely and arbitrarily awarded. They are owed to those who are deemed worthy of them. By contrast, The esteem and its material trimmings awarded by a tyrant is appraisal respect only. It depends on the whim of the sovereign. It is not owed. It is not accorded to fulfill an obligation, and it does not create or entail any actual binding claim to respect for its recipient. What we find in this passage, then, is not just another particularly poignant formulation of how healthy honor dynamics are perverted under a particular absolute ruler. We find a formulation that generalizes this perversion as a central feature of tyrannical rule. It is not just Philip or Xerxes. Such unhealthy honor dynamics are quintessential, Demosthenes claims, to tyrannical rule. They are inevitable because they are constitutive of it. As is often the case, this constellation of beliefs, intuitions, and diagnoses about political dynamics under tyranny as well as under other regimes is both corroborated and systematized by Aristotle in the Politics, particularly in chapters 10 and 11 of Book 5, where he discusses what leads to the preservation or to the downfall of kingship and tyranny. So that's what I'm going to talk about now for a while. Aristotle, and this is 12a on your handout, initially seems to draw a sharp distinction between kingship and tyranny, pointing out that kingship, like aristocracy, tends to ground its legitimate rule on some form of superiority, in virtue, wealth, or lineage. Legitimate sole rule, that is grounded in a superiority that is recognized by the subjects and therefore prizes, relatively speaking, honor more than wealth. Conversely, because tyranny is more to do with the tyrant's personal utility and ambition, he holds wealth, relatively speaking, as more important than honor, and this is 12b. Just a few lines later, however, when Aristotle moves to the actual causes of the preservation and downfall of both regimes, this distinction breaks down. He makes clear that the goals of kings and tyrants are, in the end, roughly identical. I quote, "The ends sought are also the same there as in tyrannies and kingships, since sole rulers possess the great wealth and high office that everyone desires." This passage points to a scenario of extreme accumulation of wealth and honor against the backdrop of the frustrated desire of the subjects. Such an extreme accumulation implicitly entails limitations in how much wealth and honor is then available to go around, beyond the sole ruler himself. It is as if sole rule constitutionally tended towards zero-sum honor dynamics. And the key reason for which it does, as Aristotle has already pointed out in connection with kingship, is because sole rule can only be legitimized on the grounds of the extreme superiority of one man over everyone else. So it depends not only on the sole ruler accumulating as much honor as possible for himself, but also on him depriving his subjects of honor as much as possible, so that his superiority may be so great as to justify his sole rule. Win-win honor dynamics are to a large extent incompatible with this kind of legitimation. They may maximize the amount of honor available in society, but at the same time, they are bound to undermine the sole ruler's claims to absolute superiority. And Aristotle says this in so many words. You have it at 12c on your handout, and I'll quote it. Kingships no longer arise nowadays, but if any do happen to occur, they tend more to be tyrannical sole rule. This is because nowadays there are numerous men of equal quality, although none so outstanding as to measure up to the magnitude and dignity of the office of king. Hence, people are unwilling to put up with this sort of rule. This basic point is fundamental both to explaining the actual behavior of tyrants and to identifying the causes of their downfall and the successful strategies for their preservation. When Aristotle discusses the main causes and circumstances that lead the subjects of tyrants to rebel and attempt to overturn their regimes, for instance, most prominent among these causes is contempt, kataphonesis. The passage is at 12d. In chapter 3 of book 5, when Aristotle listed the causes of stasis metabolae in general, he described contempt as causing stasis in oligarchies when the many, who have no share in the constitution, come to believe that they are in fact stronger than the rulers, and thus they despise the latter's claim to be stronger. Within Aristotle's framework, the decision to initiate stasis to change the politeia cannot depend, though, exclusively on the realization that the oligarch's claim of strength is contemptible. It must combine with an internalized conception of distributive justice, as Aristotle makes clear in that passage, that demands that timai and wealth should be distributed in accordance with worth, axia. In our passage, then, contempt for the strength, virtue, lineage, or behavior of the sole ruler is not a catalyst of stasis just because others see an opening to seize power for themselves, but precisely because his time as sole ruler is predicated on his superiority. Superior power, wealth, and honor go with superior worth. Feeling contempt for the sole ruler means denying the very superiority by virtue of which he is sole ruler. This fundamental legitimizing requirement that the superior power, wealth, honor, time, and prerogatives, timai, of the sole ruler should correspond to equally superior worth, axia, underpins Aristotle's entire model and is more generally grounded in the very nature of honor as both demeanor and deference. And therefore, it is at the basis of Aristotle's account of the ways in which kings and tyrants attempt to preserve their rule. His first suggestion at chapter 11, pertinent to kings rather than to tyrants, is for them to moderate their power, limiting their own prerogatives and distributing certain prerogatives to others. His key example here is that of Spartan kingship, the honor and prerogatives of which were split between two kings, with further prerogatives attributed to the ephors. You have the passage at 12e. Absolute power, arrogating to oneself all prerogatives, all timai, requires absolute superiority, difficult to prove and difficult to sustain. A fairer distribution of prerogatives among more than one individual has a better chance to match the respective worth of multiple parties, and therefore to be felt as legitimate, engendering less envy and contempt, and being as a result more stable. Aristotle's suggestion here points toward honor dynamics that are no longer exclusive, no longer zero-sum, yet it also veers towards a model that is no longer one of sole rule proper. The Spartan regime is famously considered by Aristotle a rather flawed mixture of monarchic, oligarchic, and democratic elements. When Aristotle turns to the strategies used by actual tyrants to preserve their power, what we find is not only grounded on the basic intuition that sole rule can only be legitimized by absolute superiority, but is also very much reminiscent of the reflections and observation that we have encountered in Demosthenes and Herodotus. The list of these strategies, which you have part of it at 12F on your handout, matches perfectly the description Demosthenes gave us of Philip's behavior, but also provides a rationale for such behavior and describes its wider societal consequences. The first strategy is to get rid of high-minded individuals. These are characterized by pride and deserving of respect for their character, qualities, and actions, and therefore are a threat to the tyrant, because their very existence makes the time of the tyrant problematic. Their worth, their axia, compared to his, makes the extreme concentration of honor, prerogatives, power in the hands of the tyrant hardly justifiable. At chapter 10, as we have seen, Demosthenes noted that nowadays there are numerous men of equal quality, hence people are unwilling to put up with this sort of rule. The presence of a high number of worthy individuals automatically makes sole rule unjust, no longer cataxian. Hence, the need to cut down outstanding men, something Aristotle had already pointed out earlier on, and you have the passage at 12G on the handout, as, I quote, the advice that Periander gave to Thrasybulus when he cut down the 20 tallest ears of corn, namely, that it is always necessary to do away with the outstanding citizens. It is also fascinating that in this passage, Aristotle stresses the connection between high-mindedness, pride, the sense of one's own worth, and pistis, trust. Aristotle is very much aware that all forms of sociality and education have the effect of strengthening social ties grounded in mutual trust and respect, pistis and time, contributing, therefore, to producing self-confident citizens aware of each other's relative value and willing to acknowledge it. Such awareness is in itself a threat to sole rule, because it leads to questioning the legitimacy of the sole ruler's position, whether he actually deserves such an exalted status vis-à-vis everyone else. The tyrant, to avoid all this, needs to prohibit public masses, associations, school, and all kinds of gatherings. He needs to reduce sociality to a minimum, creating atomized, selfish, competitive, and distrustful subjects rather than confident, self-assured, trustworthy, respected, and respectful citizens. And does this remind you of anything, by the way? He can do so by pitching his subjects against each other, fostering extreme competitiveness, widespread slander and mistrust, creating, that is, an economy of honor that is truly zero-sum, a society in which any advancement in status not only depends fully on the tyrant, but must be achieved at the expense of someone else. In such a context of mutual mistrust and of pervasive dilatory practices, Aristotle observes that individuals become small-minded, incapable of truly honorable behavior. They are, he says, like slaves, that is, dishonored and dishonorable. A few lines later, this is 12H on your handout, Aristotle gives us a summary of tyrants' aims and how these contribute to the preservation of their power. I quote, "First, the ruled must think small, for a pusillanimous person would plot against no one. Second, they must distrust one another, for a tyranny will not be overthrown until some people trust each other. This is also why tyrants attack decent people. They view them as harmful to their rule, not only because they refuse to be ruled as by my master, but also because they command trust among both themselves and others and do not inform on one another or on anyone else. And this, continues Aristotle, is why, I quote again, tyranny is fond of despicable people. Their very lack of worth is, that is, at the basis of the tyrant's superiority. And Aristotle makes this point very clearly. Last quote for a while. It is characteristic of a tyrant not to delight in anyone who is dignified or free-minded. For a tyrant thinks that he alone deserves to be like that. But anyone who is a rival in dignity or free-mindedness robs tyranny of its superiority and its status as a master of slaves. And so tyrants hate him as a threat to their rule. Aristotle's account here matches Demosthenes' description of Philip, at the same time framing the perversion of healthy honor dynamics as essential to the very existence of tyranny. These strategies, however, are admittedly risky, and Aristotle does make the point in chapter 10 that while the systematic humiliation of his subjects is functional to the tyrant's superiority, the actions through which this is achieved can be perceived as hubristic, and therefore give rise to resistance, to stasis. It is because of this tension, the fact that the very strategies that are necessary for justifying tyranny are also often conducive to stasis, that for Aristotle, tyranny tends to be brittle, not to last very long. Aristotle has some advice about these too, about how to temper this tension through other strategies that, once again, rely on shaping and managing honor dynamics for the benefit of the tyrant. And his advice in this respect reminds one very much of what Herodotus had to say about the honors accorded by the great king, and Demosthenes about why the honors received from a tyrant are inferior to those received under a democracy. Aristotle states in the passage you have at 12I that a tyrant should so honor those who prove to be good in any area that they do not expect that they would be more honored by citizens living under their own laws. As Demosthenes pointed out, tyrants can grant the most excessive rewards at will, and they should use this ability to convince their subjects that the highest honors one can achieve are those received from a sole ruler, and not those freely given by one's peers. The criterion for awarding such honors, however, is not really a particular individual's actual worth. The reward should in fact be disproportionate. Its size governs by the tyrant's self-interest rather than by the need to meet a benefactor's worth, time, axia, with appropriate respect, time. And in fact, not just the size of the rewards is governed by the tyrant's whim, or better, by his self-interest, but also how many people are so honored. It is a precaution, I'm quoting, common to every sort of monarchy not to make any one man important, but where necessary, to elevate several, so that they will keep an eye on one another. Once again, conferring honors is not functional, as it should be, to create an emulation with mutual trust and respect, but rather to create a mistrust and zero-sum competition for the favor of the king. Not only that, but, I quote again, if it happens to be necessary to make one man important, however, at all events, it should not be someone of courageous character. So behind the kinds of honorary practices that Aristotle describes as necessary for the preservation of tyranny, there is very little attention for the actual worth of the honorants, and certain kinds of worth should in fact be discouraged. There is very little attention for their claims, for their right to be honored on account of their merits and performance. Desert, the claims it gives rise to, and the obligations of respect it engenders, everything that has to do with considerations of justice, are by and large irrelevant to the tyrant's choices when it comes to honoring or punishing others. What matters is his arbitrary will, the preservation of the fundamental asymmetry of the relation. As we exercise his actions, the kind of respect that Aristotle recommends tyrants should use strategically is appraisal respect, freely and arbitrarily given, rather than recognition respect, the kind of respect that is owed, bound up in mutual claims and obligations. So it is time to wrap this up with some tentative conclusions. Demosthenes, Herodotus, and Aristotle all paint a consistent picture of the behavior of tyrants and sole rulers, of how they manage their relations with their subjects, and the kind of social environment their rule tends to give rise to. They also, by and large, agree that these dynamics are far from accidental, and they do not depend on the specific psychology of this or that ruler. They are in fact grounded in the very role and status of sole rulers. It is that very role that results in, and is in fact dependent on, the perversion of healthy honor dynamics. For a sole ruler, the pursuit of honor is by necessity a zero-sum game. The superiority that underpins his exalted status is built on a level of accumulation of status, honor, and prerogatives that is blind to the claims of others. In this sense, in the accounts we have discussed, sole rule ends up being almost constitutionally hubristic. It depends on the sole ruler, and the tyrant in particular, arrogating to himself as much time as possible, beyond what would be justifiable on most grounds, at the same time denying any rightful claims to respect from others. This does not mean, of course, that a sole ruler does not honor others, far from it. But by and large, he fails to honor those that truly deserve to be honored, and often actually humiliates them. When he does honor someone, and he honors plenty, this has less to do with justice, with fulfilling obligations of mutual respect and recognition, and with distributing honor and prerogatives according to worth, kataxion, than with self-interest, with the management of subordinates, and with preserving the fundamental asymmetry of all relations that involve them. Now, some of this is well known. Aspects of this kind of reflection have become standard features, for instance, of Republican or Neo-Roman accounts of freedom as lack of dependence or lack of dominance, from Cicero through Bruni, Machiavelli, Milton, and many others, all the way to the modern revival of these ideas in the work of thinkers such as Quentin Skinner, Philip Pettit, and Maurizio Viroli. In these accounts, lack of freedom does not require actual interference. All it needs is dependence on the arbitrary will of another. The very existence of such a relation of dependence makes true freedom impossible and fosters servile behaviors associated with courtiers, serfs, and slaves. This is the argument developed, for instance, in Viroli's The Liberty of Servants. But the distinctively Greek version of this line of argument that I have tried to outline, with its distinctive focus on time, on honor dynamics, does something more than this. It tells us what it is precisely that is perverted under the arbitrary rule of a tyrant, and in what ways that kind of rule affects society at large. Reading these power dynamics through the lenses of honor, of respect and recognition, allows us, that is, to identify what precisely was believed to be pathological under arbitrary rule. And this is the fact that it disrupts basic relations of mutual recognition, grounded in mutual claims and obligations that are essential to justice, morality, and in fact, to sociality itself. That it creates a disconnect between time as external recognition and time as dignity, worth, that it denies just claims, and it denies indeed any kind of rights. That it turns the pursuit of honor into a zero-sum competition to stand out, leaving everyone else behind, when it should rather be a cooperative enterprise in which the honor of each individual relies on and contributes to the honor of everyone else and of the community at large. Now, we can debate how much of this account is descriptive and how much is normative, prescriptive. Is it a fair portrait of Greek tyranny, of modern tyranny? Is it reductive or is it reliable? I've chosen not to go there tonight. Rather, what seems clear to me at the very least is its heuristic potential for identifying what makes a healthy society and what makes a deeply unhealthy one in ancient Greece or today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mirko, for this fascinating lecture. And I open the floor to questions or comments. If you want to say something, please raise your hand. I can see already some people doing that. So I guess the first was Mrs. Banaszkiewicz. Was that right? Ms. Banaszkiewicz? No, so sorry, maybe. Okay, so I can see Edward Harris has his hand raised.
Do you want me to speak? Are you ready for me? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, some people were trying to applaud. Apparently, I mistook it for for raising hands to say something. So,
well, I will applaud too. It was an excellent presentation, Mirko. I think you did an excellent job presenting what I would call the rule of law view of the tyrant, and went through the Aristotle's passages. Aristotle's not completely original here. As you noted, for instance, with the Aristobulus thing, that goes back to Herodotus. This is a stereotype which is being developed all the way into the kind of from late archaic period. It's developed again with Plato, and it's developed especially with Demosthenes. And I have no problem, with your analysis, Aristotle as Aristotle. The main issue is that Demosthenes' portrait of Philip is hopelessly distorted, and it's the product of an incredible stereotype. Let me give you some details. You know the essay that I published a few years ago on this topic. For instance, we know that in the stereotype of tyranny, the tyrant relies on mercenaries. And Demosthenes claims in the Olympiacs that Philip relies on mercenaries. Anybody who studied the sources know that that's false. Secondly, he says that he pays no attention, that he treats his associates with a great deal of disrespect. We can go through many examples, actually, of Philip's and especially Alexander's subordinates. He rewards them, he trusts them, he places them in positions of responsibility. So there are other examples actually of this. I won't summarize all the rest of it. But basically, what we're getting in Aristotle, and what we're getting to a certain extent, we're definitely getting in Demosthenes, is we're getting a stereotype which has been generated by the anti-tyrannical regimes, not only in Sparta but also especially though in Athens. And so what I'm just wondering, there's nothing within its confines within Aristotle and going back to Solon and Herodotus. This is quite good, but on the other hand, I'm not so sure that in reality the kings like Philip and like Alexander, who are called tyrants, whether they're not really tyrants or not, by certain other Greeks for various reasons, often tendentious, didn't have their own way, even though it was a different way of recognizing honor. And for instance, we know that, for instance, both Philip and Alexander and also the Hellenistic monarchs have a court of philoi. And their way of honoring people is not by having honorary decrees, but by actually appointing them and giving them this title of philoi. We also know that they give them grants of land. And we also know that, for instance, they will appoint them to honor their positions, especially, of course, in the army. So the only thing is, it's a caveat. Again, you did an excellent job discussing this kind of stereotype, which is developed in the Greek city-state. But I'm just wondering if the reality is different, and we get a study of honor with Alexander and also with the Hellenistic monarchs. We need to actually look at the evidence itself and begin to wonder if they had their own distinctive way of recognizing honor. Anyway, sorry, that's a long answer to. It was an excellent paper.
Yeah, thanks, Edward. Oh yeah, I mean, I have no objection about any of this. I mean, what I was interested here is in a construction of tyranny and in a diagnosis about tyranny's relationship with honor dynamics that in many ways tells more about what the Greek cities consider healthy honor dynamics than it says about tyranny and kingship itself. So it is basically relevant for the kind of argument I'm trying to make here about how these people conceptualize symmetric and asymmetric relationship, vertical or horizontal relation, whether these actually went on in tyranny. Another question would be like how much this kind of model explains, because despite the stereotype and the perversion, there are some kind of themes here that are really problematic about the relationship between sole rulership and general dynamics of mutual respect. That is, what happens to respect and honor based on reciprocity in a very asymmetrical relationship in which all the power is in the hands of somebody. They're still possible, as you said, they happen, as Herodotus admits that they happen, and Aristotle admits that they happen, but what happens to them? What goes on there? So I think studying how honor is actively used in tyrannical regimes or in monarchical regime is a very worthy project. It would be also interesting to see how monarchs justify the rules in terms of distributive justice and a distribution of time. But here, in a way, I was trying more to use the discourse about tyranny to shed some light on how the Greeks saw as healthy honor dynamics in non-tyrannical polis. You can see that as a counterpoint, and as they did that, then we can ask ourselves how much of the diagnosis, how much of the normative content of this actually has some bite.
Yeah, no, I would agree on that. I mean, I think in the sense of tyranny is often used, and this theme has come up before in the lectures that we have. Tyranny is used as a kind of antitype, as a way of defining what is normative. But to what extent that is actually distorting what was going on with people who were called tyrants, that's a separate story. But anyway, I just leave that as a suggestion. I'm sure other people will have other things to say.
Okay, so now first Anthony Ellis and then Douglas Cairns.
Hello. Yeah, thank you very much. Really interesting talk. I wanted to ask about the degree to which the stereotype of tyrannical philotomia is something which is shared across a variety of different political spectrums. So I've been looking at the stereotype of tyrannical phonos, and it very much overlaps with this. You know, what Atani says in the Persian in the constitutional debate is very similar. You know, the tyrant destroys the best, is annoyed hates his best subjects and is jealous of them whenever they show virtue, and rejoices in the worst. And you get sort of a number of different passages where that kind of theme comes up as a tyrannical idea. And my question is really, what do we make of the passages which put forward something which looks like, let's say, a monarchic ideology, but which also level the same criticism at tyrants, whether in the negative or in the positive format? So in the negative format, you have it in Pindar. He praises Hero and Theron as being without Thonos towards the best citizens, which I guess looks to me like it's playing with the same stereotype and characterizing Hero against it. And then you have Isocrates in the to Nicocles and so on, where he claims that monarchy encourages less philotomia and phonos than democracy. And it looks like he's kind of, again, trying to invert exactly the same stereotype you're making. So to formulate that into a statement, which maybe you'd either endorse or not, could we say that this is a cross-political slur of bad rulership, which both Democrats and monocrats, for want of a better word, would both endorse as a bad form of rule, but which monarchic ideology in a way incorporated into its own political vision of good monarchy?
Yeah, I think it's quite clear from the evidence that, normatively speaking, like, Thonos is often represented in whatever regime it is as the polar opposite of healthy honor dynamics. In the Against Leptinus, for example, which I've discussed in previous work as kind of a treatise on honor and ergotism, sui generis. What happens there, for example, is that Demosthenes says, if you start taking away awards that you have given, honors that you have given to benefactors in the past for whatever utilitarian reason, then that's unlike you. That's not your character. That's Thonos, and you cannot give in to Thonos. So it's almost kind of the normatively negative polar opposite of how things should be. And therefore, in the way these dynamics are represented, it stands to reason that whenever a regime is trying to defend itself, in a way, they would attribute Thonos to somebody else or defends itself from accusations of Thonos. In a way, though, the question you make connects a bit with what Edward was saying. I mean, I don't know. I mean, this kind of stuff seems to come up a lot when it comes to tyrants, and not just in the ancient world. I mean, that kind of, and you can talk about these in terms of tradition. Monarchical rule, authoritarian rules is framed in a way that has a long genealogy from the Greek world through this kind of republican tradition, which means that there is a kind of stereotyping that is available and keeps being reused. Or if you want to be a bit more ambitious or a bit more daring, you can start thinking that perhaps the reason for which this stuff, particularly at times when monarchical regimes were prevalent, for example, in the course of Renaissance Italy with the signori and stuff like that, this stuff was so much reused because there's something to it. And I do think that normatively there is some merit in Aristotle's line. If you want to justify so rule, you need to justify it in terms of a superiority, and you need to do it in a way or another. And that kind of tends to give rise to some sort of zero-sum dynamics, which means that tyrants, or anyway, sole ruler, have a tendency to be characterized by more pervasive thonos than others. So as often, I suspect Aristotle here and this kind of analysis is both stereotyping, therefore not true all of the time, but he's into something. There is something there, I think. You can see it also not in proper political scene. I mean, this kind of perversion of honor dynamic and zero-sum dynamic tend to emerge, for example, in any academic context that is characterized by strong verticality and asymmetry. You see it in many colleagues, so it's not just there. So I think, yes, we need to give this kind of regime the benefit of the doubt and study them properly, but there is something to it, I think.
Thanks very much.
Okay, Professor Cairns.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed, Mirko. That was a great paper. As you were talking, I could only think of our own dear University of Edinburgh and its mechanisms for distributing recognition, respect, or not, as the case may be. I wanted to pick up a point we've talked about before, which also relates to what Anthony and Edward were saying, especially about norms and how tyrants are used to articulate these norms. And it's in your passage, what is it? The second one about Pythias, it's passage 10.
Yep.
So you were talking there about the demonstration in that passage of the arbitrary will of the monarch or the tyrant, by contrast with the need to show recognition, respect. And we had a debate there about zero-sum versions of honor and positive-sum versions of honor. The thing that interests me about that passage is that Xerxes is trying to have some things both ways. Yeah. So there's an implication there in this demonstration of generosity that he performs, that as if charis could be zero-sum. So what he's saying is, no, I'm not one of these guys who gives back only what he's received and only takes in proportion to what he's been given. He's implying that he's going beyond that in a generous way. He says, you won't boast that your good deeds surpassed mine. Now that you've changed, I'm not going to punish you as severely as you deserve. So he's saying that the return exceeds the benefit that he received, or did exceed the benefit that he received, and the retaliation is going to fall short of the harm that he's received. But of course, this is absolutely normal. This is how charis maintains cooperation.
Yep.
It maintains the obligation of recognition and respect because you feel that you've received more from this guy and you need to give more back in order that you can continue cooperating with this guy because he's then received more from you and will want to give back more to put you in the inferior position and in the position where you need to reciprocate. So charis is fundamentally not zero-sum, and of course charis is about recognition and respect. It's about honor. So the interesting thing there is that Xerxes recognizes how reciprocity works, and he represents himself as manifesting it as it's supposed to work. But of course, you're absolutely right that he did in fact refuse the original benefaction, and in retaliating for the offense that he thinks he's received, he's going insanely over the top. So he received a request to spare one of 5 sons from going on the expedition, and he responds by cutting that son in half. So this is maniacally obsessive with regard to his own honor. And it's clear that he doesn't want to be beholden. He always wants to maintain the upper hand in exchange. So he's engaging in an elaborate performance of actually observing the logic of reciprocity. But it's his actual behavior and what we deduce about the motivation behind it that shows that he doesn't really understand the dynamics of mutuality. So he pretends that he's constrained by the norms, he pretends that he abides by the norms, but he in fact perverts them. And in fact, as we've seen over the past couple of weeks, the perversion is especially horrific because it pays lip service to the norms, because it's invoking the norms even in the perversion of them.
Yeah, I think, I mean, that passage is fascinating in many ways. I mean, one thing, like for example, if you look for, there's nothing wrong with Pythias' request, second request. That request is wrong or unacceptable only if you envision reciprocity as this continuous cycle in which I do you, you do me, and stuff like that. But that's not how generalized reciprocity works. We have some kind of relationship. You do a favor to me, you can do another favor next time. That still means the relationship is going. So Pythias didn't do anything wrong, and there is
no.
So I think you're right there about the paying lip service to the norms, and I think this goes back to what we were talking a bit about earlier. That is, I don't think this is just a matter. I think there is a genuine difficulty, which Herodotus and Aristotle pinpoint, in having absolute asymmetry in power,
Yeah.
yet correctly enacting honor dynamic in a way that is sustainable and perceived as right. Because honor dynamics intrinsically do create mutual obligations.
So they create them asymmetrically. So the point there is that there's an asymmetry built into the dynamics of Charis. But the asymmetry between Xerxes and his subjects is greater than that relationship actually allows.
Exactly. So you can have asymmetrical relations, honor relations, and you can have within this relation still have mutual respect and mutual obligations going on. But when it comes to that kind of rule, that absolute asymmetry of power, that extreme one, it can't even do that. That's why I stress the kind of eventually kind of goes into arbitrary. It's just kind of doing lip service. Xerxes claims he's doing it like that, but he's not. He's just
that was my point. But I mean, it's not just sheer arbitrary whim. So he says, I'm doing exactly what's expected of me in this situation. I am returning more than I received, and I'm retaliating less than I suffered. So he's observing the rule that's stated by Hesiod in the Works and Days, that give back what you've received and give back a little more as well, because that maintains the relationship.
Yeah, he's stating it, but he's not doing it.
No, he's not. Yeah, but it's interesting that he does feel constrained by the norms, at least to the extent of having to pay lip service to them.
Yeah, and that kind of goes, and that would kind of lend credence to the basic point that Aristotle seems to make, that there is something constitutionally brittle in this kind of regime, something constitutionally wrong about them. Because even in enacting the absolute inequality of power, they need to give lip service to this kind of mutual obligation, and yet they don't quite manage to do it properly. But they still keep kind of normatively having to attach themselves to that, because that's the norm. Even there, that's the norm.
So I mean, the thing that gives the lie to Xerxes' maintenance or apparent maintenance of this normative relationship is that when it doesn't go the way he likes, he calls Pythias a slave. So it was never a relationship in the first place.
Exactly. Yeah.
I have a question, Mirko, because you talked about the tyrant sort of monopolizing honor and depriving his subjects of it. But when you I mean, some psychoanalytic writers in the 20th century pointed out that actually narcissism, which is of course closely connected in psychoanalysis with that, narcissism or self-esteem has, for instance, Heinz Kohut said it has those two poles. So one pole is my self-worth and my desire to be recognized, but the other pole is that I idealize someone and I don't have to be worthy, but my connection to someone who is admired gives me some sort of self-esteem. Of course, psychoanalysts would link it to the experience of a child. A child can be extremely proud of his father, even though he doesn't have any qualities of his father, but he can boast about his father. So when you look at tyrannical regimes, like, for instance, I think it could be argued that in regimes like Nazi Germany or maybe contemporary Russia as well, I mean, people can identify with the tyrant in a way, so that they don't feel they are worthy or acknowledge themselves as individuals. But when the tyrant is powerful, for instance, they have some vicarious sense of honor by identifying with the tyrant, which, of course, as we know, can make people suffer poverty and suffering of war. But the thought of being the subjects of someone powerful can give some kind of narcissistic gratification to them. So do you find anything like that in ancient sources? The idea that people can identify with a ruler, be it a king or a monarch, and from this gather their self-esteem?
Right. Okay, so you find a lot of these. I mean, that is one of the quintessential characteristic of non-zero-sum honor, in the sense that, for example, the honor of somebody that is close to me, with whom I have a relationship and stuff like that, contributes to my own honor in the same way in which the honor of a great general or benefactor or a great athlete will contribute to the honor of the city in which he lives, this kind of thing, no? So this is completely normal to some extent. And I do think that the kind of dynamics that we have, for example, with the Persian king or Hellenistic kings having this cause and granting honor as philoi, is another example of this kind of paying, at least to a certain extent, paying lip service to this kind of dynamic. They emphasize that there is connection, and the connection itself is a source of honor that can be carried on in relation. So I think that's, to a certain extent, what's going on there. I think what is problematic, though, is that the honor that you get in that respect, because of the way the tyrant enacts it, in many respects tends to be zero-sum, because you going up in the court means somebody else going down, or this kind of dynamic, which means that even of that kind of respect as reflected light from the tyrant, the accusation seems to be in ancient sources that there is a limited amount to go around, and people have to strive for each other, and that's the kind of way the tyrant wants it. So I think what you mentioned is certainly there. I do have a bit more problem with the kind of modern application of that to regimes like Nazi Germany, in the sense that I suspect there was a lot to do with self-worth and with assuming a dignity or a certain level of honor by association with something. But it was more kind of nationalistic or racist or ethnic construct that did that. There was a whole creation of a kind of a higher race. And even without going to Nazi Germany, I mean, that seems to be the case. There is a reason for which kind of right-wing form of authoritarian-leaning populism have a particular pull on the lower classes in much of Europe and the West, because the sources of honor and respect are few and far between for those kind of areas in a context of extreme inequality, yet they can derive some kind of self-worth by aggrandizing their membership to a particularly honorable identity of that kind. So I think, but yeah, I mean, honor certainly is the kind of thing you can get by association, by membership, or by being near to somebody. That's certainly part of what goes on there, and the Greek sources have plenty that.
Yeah, but I was rather thinking about a paradoxical situation. You are humiliated because you are in yourself nothing, being a subject of a tyrant, but at the same time you identify with the tyrant, so you fantasize of being someone great because you're part of a race or a nation or whatever. So that there is a certain paradox which I think goes beyond what you described, the feeling of a connection to something greater, which is of course a natural thing. But yeah, that's I think it's fair to say that it's a universal phenomenon.
Some kind of Stockholm syndrome kind of thing.
Well, that's another thing. Okay, so James Kierstead has a question.
Hey, Mirko, I really enjoyed your talk. I think you've identified a really interesting dynamic for tyrants. I just wanted to ask you more about the democratic side of the equation now, how you see this as playing out in Athens in particular, which I know you've studied. So in terms of citizenship, for example, you talked about this recognition form of honor. So when you become an Athenian citizen, is that you're being recognized? And is that different in this context to appraisal, particularly because Athenian citizenship also involves you being vetted in certain ways. You have to have 2 Athenian parents. So are those processes, deems and phratries, are they doing some kind of appraisal? And does that push Athenian citizenship a little bit further from the recognition dynamic towards the appraisal dynamic? I'm interested partly in this because we had this theme in a previous lecture discussion about to what extent is ancient democracy different from modern democracy in its approach towards human rights? Because it seems that in the modern world, we're very much in a recognition dynamic. You sort of get granted human rights solely by virtue of being human. Okay, maybe within a certain policy you get granted citizenship rights solely by virtue of having a passport or whatever it is. But it's compared to the ancient world, it's sort of a bit more. Compared to the polis, it's a bit more generous in terms of the ability to meet these qualifications.
Right. Yeah, I mean, That's a very good question. So, first of all, I mean, I think Dowell's distinction between recognition and appraisal respect is great as far as it goes, in the sense that there are some problematic element to it. For example, like while the distinction between recognition respect as something that is due, as something that creates an that is out of an obligation, you cannot choose to respect one or not, like a status, you have to recognize it, and appraisal respect as being kind of free. That works very, very well, no? But for example, Dowell being a bit too kind of flattened on the modern word, seems to consider recognition respect sometimes the kind of thing that needs to be attached to intrinsic characteristic, like common humanity and that kind of thing, no? And therefore, if there is any performative element, any element of appraisal, then that is automatically appraisal respect. If you dig a bit harder, you realize that in reality, like recognition respect, the kind of respect that comes with a particular status, with a feature that you have with being the son of two citizens of a nation that or one citizen that gives you citizenship to of that place. Yes, it comes with something that is not performative per se, but still often has performative elements to it. You can lose citizenship in a Greek state, or you can lose your freedom. Everybody's got a right to freedom by being born and so on, but you can lose your freedom. So there is always a performative element, and that performance is appraised, but that doesn't make it appraisal respect. Appraisal respect is just kind of free esteem in a way. So citizenship, as you discussed in Athens and in many cities, is actually called a kind of time, and it is also kind of a constellation of timai, or prerogatives that go with that particular status. That in that sense, it's a status, it's a kind of honor, it's a form of recognition, respect that they have to accord to you because you have a claim to these things, and it has performative elements to it. Look, think about the against the Marcus. If you prostitute yourself as a young boy, you're going to lose it. But still, as long as you don't, you have a right to it. So I think that all kind of constellation of thing has to do with time and honor, and it has to do primarily recognition respect. And I'll tell you more, even the honors for benefactor are appraisal respect only in a very initial and initial sense, in the sense that there is a strong element of appraisal, and I am assessing a performance, but they turn into claims to obligate to recognition respect very fast, because once you get them, you get them. And also because if you behave in a certain way in the context of a Greek city, like if you do certain benefaction, there is kind of an expectation that you'll be honored. And if you don't, you get annoyed, and people know things, well, you deserved it. And somebody will bring it up. So the whole kind of constellation of how time is used, whether it's the time of a citizen or the differential time of special benefactor, has got a very strong element that is recognition respect, in the sense that it has to do with mutual relation of claims and obligations.
Yeah, that's where I was. Yeah, that's exactly where I was going to go with this. That it's almost as if there's a spectrum in the democratic polis of there's all these opportunities to be recognized and to have time given to you, whether it's just sort of this sort of default basic time of a citizen, which is still something compared to some other people, right? Or it's the sort of higher level time, and then you have all these various spaces within the polis, whether they're associations or institutions, where time is almost institutionalized. So it's almost like the polis is a kind of factory of time in a way, which is obviously the polar opposite to the kind of dynamics you've identified in tyrannies, where it's the key thing there is to keep a lid on other people's time, so that your own sort of pops up more grandly.
Whereas in Athens, in democracies, it is meant to be generalized. Think about the hortatory clauses. We are honoring you so that everybody will behave like that and will be honored for it. And we also have evidence that, for example, like sometimes, for example, for an outgoing council at the end of a year, there was an expectation that they'd be honored, in the sense that if they've done something wrong, if they didn't get honored, that was paramount to say that they'd done something illegal, they failed to do so.
Okay, we have maybe time for one more question. I saw Edward Harris was raising his hand.
Yeah, Mirko, just quickly, tyrannical regimes still will need to use rewards of honor to motivate public service. And I want to give you just one quick example. Under the Tsarist regime, one of the ways of giving people honor was to give them epaulets in the military on their uniform. One of the things the Soviets did immediately, because they wanted to have complete equality, was they got rid of epaulets. And actually, during the Civil War, a lot of the Bolsheviks would actually nail the epaulets to the into the shoulders, actually, when they were as an atrocity. What was interesting, they completely banished them under the Soviet army. But in the Second World War, when they needed to motivate people to fight the Nazis, they actually reintroduced epaulets, and you'll see epaulets now actually in the Russian army. So even a tyrannical regime will still need honors in the same way. But on the other hand, for instance, to illustrate your point about the weakness of these, there were five marshals who were given special honors in the Soviet Union in 1936. But again, it shows you, and this illustrates your point from Leptines, we know that 3 of those marshals and many of the division commanders, many of the army commanders, many of the corps commanders were all executed, which just shows that in a tyrannical regime, you may have honors, but they are very, very, very fragile. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point, and of course, I mean, that's what Aristotle says. Tyrants need giving honors is one of the main ways to keep, but you have to give them in a certain way, and you have to be careful, because honor can give rise to people that emerge, can give to self-respect and stuff like that. I mean, I wonder whether the difference between the Soviet Union approach of not having epaulets for everybody and, for example, the Athenian approach is that sometimes I feel like in Athens, the expectation was that you would kind of have a system in place that would encourage everybody to get epaulets rather than, which means that you kind of equalize out, you will level up rather than level down. That was the expectation. The point was not falling short rather than stand out. But that's another paper, I guess.
Okay, thank you. We have to stop. Unfortunately, the discussion is equally interesting as your lecture was, Mirko, but we have to wrap up. So thank you once more for your paper, and I thank all of you for discussion, your questions and comments. And we see each other next time, hopefully on the 6th of April, to hear a lecture by Elodie Bayard on tyranny and art, poetry, literature. So that sounds interesting too. So thank you again, and see you next time.
Thank you very much.